Hello, everyone. Today's guest is Dr. Carmen Imes. She's the Associate Professor of Old Testament at Biola University. Today, we'll talk about whether the Bible endorses slavery, if we should still bother reading the Old Testament, and Dr. Imes will share her thoughts about Friedrich Nietzsche's opinion of the Bible. Today's episode is fantastic. I think Dr. Imes has so much to contribute in the way of understanding the Bible through cultural lens in both the Old and New Testament. I really encourage you to hear everything that she has to say. It really made my day. Thank you so much for listening, and please welcome to the show, Dr. Carmen Imes. Dr. Imes, thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me, Tucker. It's good to be here.
So, you teach a class at Biola called Old Testament, I believe.
Mhm.
Um, can you talk to me a little bit about why we in the modern day should still read the Old Testament? Why not substitute it for the New Testament? Isn't it a little old to still be taking seriously?
Yeah, I would say reading the New Testament without the Old Testament is kind of like walking into a movie theater 3/4 of the way through a movie and expecting to have a great experience. And you'll be puzzled most of the time because people are talking about things you didn't witness. There's a plot that you don't fully understand. And you could probably pick out who are the main characters and where is this all going, but you'll feel a little bit lost. And I think reading the New Testament without the Old Testament does that to us. We don't understand where this all started. What are we even trying to accomplish? And where's it headed?
Hmm, that's helpful. Can you talk a little bit about um, in the New Testament people
Hmm.
will quote the Old Testament, will make
Hmm.
direct references.
Yeah.
How much of that scripture were they aware of?
Mm.
How important was it to them?
Hmm. We can see that it was very important to them. Not every single part of the Old Testament gets quoted in the New Testament, but the Old Testament is everywhere in the New Testament. If you went through and just highlighted all of the quotations and allusions and echoes, there would be hardly a paragraph without stuff highlighted. It thoroughly informed how they thought about the world, how they thought about their purpose, who they were. And so it's hard to it's impossible to overstate the importance of the Old Testament. Jesus quotes it left, right, and center. And four of the books that get quoted most often are Psalms, Isaiah, Genesis, and Deuteronomy. I think those are the top four. And to be honest, there's a lot of Christians who don't read the Psalms, who know very little about Isaiah, and who would struggle to recognize Deuteronomy. So I think we have a lot of work to do if we want to understand the thought world of the New Testament writers.
So, if someone's studying the Old Testament, do you feel like those four books would be the most important Old Testament books to be literate in?
They would certainly be strategic. I think another really important book would be the book of Exodus
Hmm.
because the storyline of the Exodus actually informs so much of the rest of the Bible. Israel cannot be who they're meant to be without the story of the Exodus. That's where they become a nation, where God rescues them from slavery in Egypt, where they're constituted as his people at Mount Sinai, and then where he tells them, here's how to live so that you can be on mission.
Hmm. Yeah. And so, talking a little bit about Jesus,
Mhm.
who you mentioned before, I think someone who has at least like moderate familiarity with the New and Old Testament,
Mhm.
um, might critique them by saying, "You guys, Christians, would say that the God of the Old Testament is the same as the God of the New Testament, and
Mhm.
Jesus is, um, the Son incarnate."
Mhm.
Um, but they don't seem at all the same. The
Mhm.
God of the Old
Mhm.
Testament is, having people killed and is giving out laws that are like, if
Mhm.
they do this particular thing, kill them.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
Jesus talks some more, um, at least on surface level, more lovingly, turn
Mhm.
the other cheek. Can you talk a little bit more about how those two seemingly disparate
Yeah.
uh, representations of God can be
Mhm.
understood?
Yes. It really is kind of a trope that people point to all the time, that the God of the Old Testament is full of wrath and the God of the New Testament is full of grace. And there seems to be such a disconnect between the two. And I would say we overstate the wrath of God in the Old Testament, and we miss all of the ways that he demonstrates his grace. And we understate the wrath of God in the New Testament. I mean, have you read the book of Revelation? That's in the New Testament. And it's a quite a bloody book. There's a lot of death and destruction and plagues and all of that, and it's part of the New Testament. So I think we need to read the whole Bible more slowly and more thoughtfully, and we'll begin to see the ways that the character of God is unchanging. The amount of mercy that God shows his people in the Old Testament when they fail to keep his laws, when they go off and worship other gods after he's just rescued them, he shows so much mercy time and again. And that's the kind of mercy that we see from Jesus in the New Testament. And Jesus also is the one who turns over the tables in the temple and drives out the money changers with a whip. And he tells the Pharisees and religious leaders, "You brood of vipers." You know, he calls them names. He heaps abuses on them. And so Jesus is not as meek and mild as we sometimes paint him to be. And again, there's so much grace in the Old Testament that we miss, partly because I think we fail to appreciate what a different cultural context it is. And so sometimes we hear harsh language and we overinterpret it or we overread it. For example, when God sends his people into the promised land, obviously there's battles with the Canaanites and people die. And so often people will assume that what God wanted and authorized was a bloodbath, when in fact, if you go back and read carefully what God was actually asking them to do when they got into the land, the violence that he describes is not towards people, it's towards objects. Break down their altars, smash their sacred poles, get rid of their idols, wipe out their names, the names of the idols from the place. He doesn't say cut off their heads and then cut off their thumbs and then cut them off at the knees. Like, he doesn't describe any methods of torture. Yes, I'm not trying to say that nobody died when the Israelites entered the land, but killing people was not the point of it. It was dismantling the societies that were gathered around the worship of false gods. And so I think we overstate the violence on God's part going into a book like Joshua. And then we also, because it's not our context, we fail to appreciate that this is the way people talked about warfare. And that in the ancient Near East, all warfare was divine warfare. And every battle is a matter of demonstrating which god is superior to which other god. And so this wasn't about people being greedy. In fact, the Israelites were not allowed to keep the plunder from any of these battles in Canaan. It wasn't for them. It was about dismantling worship. So sometimes I describe it as if Biola, one of our sports teams, let's say our water polo team, is playing an away game and they really, like, they have a resounding victory and they come back to campus and they say, "We crushed them." You know, we're not actually worried at that point that the other team's water polo players are now all in the ER having surgery.
Right.
Yeah. Like, to crush someone in an athletic contest is to win by a large margin. And there is a lot of stock phrasing and standard ways of talking about warfare that are probably making it sound worse than it actually was.
Wow, that's very interesting. Yeah. What would you say to someone? Do you think it's legitimate? For example, maybe someone who is not Buddhist would still appreciate the moral teachings of Buddha. What would you say to someone who says, "I appreciate the moral teachings of Jesus as kind of like a guide to way as a way to go about your life, but I can't stomach the Old Testament or like the other things that like Christianity is or the Bible can be associated
Sure.
with."
That's an excellent question. I would say it's impossible to understand the moral teachings of Jesus without the Old Testament. What he's saying for his disciples, the way he wants them to live, comes straight out of the Old Testament. He's pointing them back to God's instructions at Sinai, and he is helping them to recover and refocus what the purpose of those instructions really was. So many people in their generation had become really particular about obeying it in certain ways, and they started to miss the big picture. So Jesus, in his famous Sermon on the Mount, for example, is saying, "You have heard that it was said, 'Do not murder,' but I tell you, anyone who says to his brother, 'You fool,' is in danger of the fires of hell."
Mm.
Um, he's identifying the truth that murder actually starts in the heart
Mm.
as a posture towards someone else, a posture of anger and a lack of um, a lack of care for or lack of compassion for our neighbor is what sows the seeds that grow eventually into murder. And so Jesus is not saying, the 10 Commandments were not effective, I'm going to raise the bar. I think he's actually taking them back to the heart of the 10 Commandments as they were first expressed.
Mm. Do you think it would be appropriate to say that Jesus or the New Testament on the whole provides some clarity on some of the more ambiguous passages of the Old Testament?
I definitely think that the New Testament provides some clarity with regard to ways that the Old Testament was being misinterpreted in the first century.
Mm.
I don't know that it's clarifying an ambiguity that's latent in the text
Mm.
necessarily, or that had always been a problem. But I definitely think there are correctives. I think every generation has need of correction. We need to see what are our blind spots, or how are we spinning this the wrong way.
Mm.
And so Jesus helps people go back to the heart of the law. Sometimes people pit Jesus against Moses as though Moses was all legalistic and Jesus was wanting to focus on the spirit of the law, and he was doing away with Moses, even though Jesus says, "I've not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it." Like, I'm here to do this. I'm here to live in a way that's faithful to the covenant. I think Jesus and Moses are hanging out in heaven right now, and I think they get along just great. I think they actually have the same heart posture towards God's commands.
Mm. Can you talk a little bit about why, for example, like Levitican laws, such as like getting tattoos or things like that, even though, I mean, I suppose Jesus didn't speak directly on the tattoo topic, but Jesus came and kind of, uh, I don't want to say clarified, we just talked about how that's
Yeah,
not true,
well,
but
yeah, he sheds
um,
light on.
sheds light
Yeah.
on some of the laws in Leviticus and kind of upend some of the Levitican laws, why there's still so much debate nowadays about like which ones do we keep and
Mm.
which ones do we get rid of.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that there's so much argument about that.
Yeah. I'm not sure that he upends any of them, actually.
Oh.
In a surprising way, he seems to be concerned with his disciples keeping the law. So several times he heals someone, like when he heals people of leprosy, he says to them, "Go show yourself to the priest." He's still complying and asking them to comply with the Levitical framework. In fact, we often think of Jesus as the one who said, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself," but he's actually quoting Leviticus. That's from Leviticus 19.
Mm.
So loving your neighbor is something Jesus is saying, yes, Leviticus said this, and we still need to be doing this. In fact, if you love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself, you'll be doing all the commands. And really, the law in the Old Testament is fleshing out all the different ways that love for God and love for neighbor should be expressed. So, for example, in Exodus, there's a law that says, if you see your enemy's ox or donkey wandering away and lost, you shall return it to your enemy. Like, you're not supposed to just look at it and go, "Oh, I know whose that is. I'm going to let that one go. It serves them right." You're supposed to take that animal back to your neighbor who doesn't like you, who is like an enemy. And if you see a donkey of one who hates you and it's fallen down under its load, you shall not pass by. Stop and help your neighbor with the load, lifting the load off of his donkey. So there's just a lot of specific ways in the Old Testament law that illustrate, here's what it might look like to be a good neighbor. And Jesus says, yes, let's think about this and let's lean into it.
Mm.
Certainly there are changes in the New Testament because the cultural context has changed. And because of the death and resurrection of Jesus, some of the Levitical laws are not relevant in the same ways that they were. But what's so interesting is Christians often will try to divide the law into three categories: moral, civil, and ceremonial. and they'll say, well, we don't live in a theocracy, with Yahweh as our king, so we don't need the civil laws. And we don't need the ceremonial laws because we don't have a temple anymore and Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice. So all we have to pay attention to is the moral laws. But actually, the New Testament authors draw freely from all supposedly three categories. I don't think anyone would have actually identified these as separate categories in the ancient world. But they draw freely from all of them to inform the Christian life after the death and resurrection of Jesus. I mean, the book of Hebrews makes a big deal out of the sacrificial system and the tabernacle as a means for helping us understand Christ and what he's accomplished. So if we just get rid of the book of Leviticus, thinking, oh, we don't need this one anymore, we're going to lose our essential glossary for helping us understand what Christ did.
Hmm. Can you explain to me, because I really don't know, but there are certain laws that like come to mind
Mm-hmm.
that we would not say that we observe
Mm-hmm.
anymore. For example, I think near the tattoo passage
Mm-hmm.
is something about like no braiding hair and no wearing jewelry.
That's a New
Um,
Testament law, actually.
oh, is that really?
It
Okay.
is. Yeah. In Peter, I think it says not to. Paul and or Peter talk about not braiding, not being given to braiding of hair, jewelry,
Hmm.
and probably this has to do with the Greco-Roman context, where to have your hair braided, the way he's talking about, would have required multiple hours of slave labor
Oh.
to do it. So it's a kind of ostentatious display of wealth. If you're wealthy enough to have servants stand around and braid your hair all morning long so that you look like that, that's actually a misuse of your resources,
Hmm.
and it's kind of exploitative. But you've mentioned a couple times the tattoo law. I think that's an interesting one to consider because it can be a nice case study for what should we do with Old Testament law.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, you probably know lots of people with tattoos,
Yes, yeah.
as I do as well, and they're Christians, and it's like, well, why do you have a tattoo?
And a lot of people that I look up to, so I'm not seeing
Mm-hmm.
them being like, "Oh, you're making a mistake." I just
Right.
think I don't fully understand.
Yeah. So the law against tattoos is in Leviticus 19, verse 28. Do not cut your bodies for the dead or put tattoo marks on yourselves. I am Yahweh. This is one place it appears. It also appears in Deuteronomy chapter 14. That one is a little bit fuller expression
Hmm.
of the same command, same idea. And by reading it in its cultural context, I think we can see what's going on here. So Deuteronomy 14 says, "You are children of Yahweh your God. Do not cut yourselves or shave the front of your heads for the dead, for you are a people holy to Yahweh your God. Out of all the peoples on the face of the earth, Yahweh has chosen you to be his treasured possession." Okay, that one doesn't say tattoo, but it's talking about same bodily disfigurement
Both have the language of like scouring or like cutting yourself to
for
some
the dead.
degree.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the question is, okay, what is this prohibiting? And I think in any case that we're looking at an Old Testament law, it's helpful to ask, what's the principle behind this? What would this have communicated in that ancient context? If somebody was tattooed, what did that mean? Does it mean they're a rebellious teenager? Or what is it actually saying? And what we find when we study tattoos in the ancient world is that mainly they were used for slaves, to mark slaves as the property of someone else. So God has just rescued his people from slavery in Egypt. He says, don't put tattoo marks on yourselves. It's a way of saying, don't re-enslave yourselves. You belong to me now. Don't give yourself away to another. No human can own you. You belong to me. When someone gets a tattoo today, it isn't saying that. We don't tattoo slaves today. So I think that's an important piece of the context to understand. In Deuteronomy 14, when it's saying you're a people holy to Yahweh your God, it's saying you belong to me. The laws are helping them see how to live out that identity or that vocation among the nations. And so if you're going to get a tattoo, I would say today, make sure that that marking on your body does not contradict your Christian witness in some way.
Hmm.
Make sure it doesn't contradict your claim that you follow Jesus and you belong to God and you're on mission in the world. Now, that means there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all answer about tattoos,
Hmm.
because there are actually cultural contexts where to be on mission in that context, one should not have a tattoo because it's not going to land right culturally. And maybe some listeners would say, well, that's true now. Depending on your generation, depending on whether you're rural or urban or what part of the country or world you live in,
Mm.
tattoos might still have a connotation of being deeply rebellious or have some negative connotation like that. And I'm not advocating rebellion. But if a Christian gets a tattoo that is symbolic of their belonging to God, then I don't see how that's a violation of the original law in
Right.
Leviticus, because it doesn't contradict that identity and vocation.
That's helpful also because it gets away from being like overly legalistic
Mm-hmm.
or just making it too black and white.
Yep.
There's like a spectrum of
Yep.
understanding.
Yep.
You hit on something else that's really interesting, and I know that you talked about this in the class that I take with you. Um, and you give a really lovely explanation that I couldn't re-articulate. Can you talk a little bit about um, why the Bible doesn't endorse slavery, or why it's being
Mm-hmm.
misinterpreted? Because that
Yes.
seems like a very critical passage to understand.
Yes, I'm happy to talk about that. There are some laws in the Old Testament that some English translations use the word slave or slavery in the laws, and I believe that's deeply misleading.
Mm.
Because for most of us in the U.S. context, when we hear slavery, we think of the transatlantic slave trade and the
Yes, of course.
antebellum South. And we're talking about the buying and selling of human beings as property for permanent possession, and you can do with them whatever you want, and you force them to work for you and you don't owe them anything. This is never endorsed by the biblical text. So, for example, in Exodus 21, there are some laws about servants. I'm looking at the NIV here, and the NIV heading says Hebrew servants. And so I think that's a better term for it, because what happens when you read all of the laws in Exodus, so they span from 20 to 23, chapters 20 to 23. All of these laws taken as a whole have all kinds of guardrails in place to make sure that no one is being exploited. So there's already a law saying human trafficking is prohibited. There's a very serious law saying if you take advantage of a widow or someone who's fatherless, you are incurring the most stringent wrath of God. And so you can't traffic in slaves. You can't take advantage of someone. You can't charge interest to your fellow Hebrew.
Mhm.
So there's all kinds of safety nets in place or guardrails. You're not allowed to harvest your fields every year. The seventh year, you have to leave it fallow, and it's being left fallow. That is, things can just grow on their own, but you don't get to harvest it, so that the needy people in your community can go and take whatever grows naturally during that year. This is true of fruit trees, of olives, of grapevines, of any kind of crop. So there's a built-in mechanism or a built-in safety net for anyone who's vulnerable in the community. If that safety net fails and there's still someone who is unable to work their own land and provide for their own needs, and they are in debt and unable to pay their debt, then there is this institution of indentured servitude, which is voluntary and temporary. And it's strictly regulated. And that's what we're looking at in Exodus 20. It says, if you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years. And the word buy is misleading, I think, here, because it's about hiring. Someone is offering himself freely to you as a laborer to pay off a debt over the course of 6 years. That's what it is. And it's the upper limit, that's 6 years. No one can pay off a debt for longer than that. Like, you actually have to forgive the rest of it, which would discourage the wealthy from allowing the poor to just rack up lots of debt, right? It's another safety, like a guardrail in place. But then it says, in the seventh year, he shall go free without paying anything. So you can't make it a situation like many forms of modern day debt slavery, where someone comes to work for an owner, say a brickmaker, and somehow their living expenses are always more than what they make making bricks, and so their debt actually grows rather than shrinks over the course of their service, so they can never get free. This is quite common in prostitution. It's quite common in brick slavery, say in India. That's not allowed. They get to go free when it's time to go. There's nothing to pay. Then some people get really troubled by verse 7 because it says, if a man sells his daughter as a servant, she is not to go free as male servants do, which just sounds all wrong. Why is a man selling his daughter? Why does she not get to go free like the men do? And so again, we need to slow down, consider the cultural context. Every marriage relationship in the ancient world involves the exchange of wealth between two families, and every marriage is arranged by the woman's father with the groom and his family. And so this is not about selling a daughter into slavery. It's about a man arranging a place for his daughter, but in this case, presumably, the man is so impoverished that he doesn't have a dowry to send with her. And so there's still wealth that passes hands from the groom's family. They'll still pay a bride price, but there's no dowry going with her. So it's a unidirectional wealth transfer instead of both directions. And the reason she can't go free as male servants do is because she is marrying into the family. She is sexually involved with the family, either with the man or with his son, not both. And that's also really clear. The man is arranging for her to come for himself or for his son. But if it's for his son, then he has to treat her like a daughter, which means she's off limits sexually. So there's no sex slavery here. She's marrying into the family, and that's why she can't go free. You can't just use her sexually for 6 years and then send her home. And now she's unmarriageable. She's actually a permanent member of the family, and she has to be treated well.
Wow. That's a thorough explanation as well. Thank you very
Mm-hmm.
much. That's very helpful. Um, for the last 10 minutes or so here, I'd like to take a different approach to
Sure.
kind of the same topic. Um, there's a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche I'd like to read, and I'd just love to get your thoughts on it.
Sure.
The quote goes, in the Jewish Old Testament, the book of divine justice, there are men, things, and sayings on such an immense scale that Greek and the Indian literature has nothing to compare with it. One stands with fear and reverence before those stupendous remains of what man was formerly. The taste for the Old Testament is a touchstone with respect to great and small. To have bound up this New Testament, a kind of rococo taste in every respect, along with the Old Testament into one book, as the Bible, is perhaps the greatest audacity which literary Europe has upon its conscience. What do you think about that? This is an uncommon opinion. I'm sure I've never seen this anywhere else. But that's also why I'm curious to hear what you think.
Yeah, so if I'm hearing him right, and this is a very interesting source, obviously for such a if I'm hearing him right, it's a pretty positive estimation of the Bible,
Hmm.
and it's it's like an audacious literary project that spans so much time and is so enduring and undying. That's how I'm hearing it.
Yeah.
It sounds like he has a lot of respect for the Bible. Again, ironic considering the source.
Sure. Yeah.
I think he's right. I mean, I'm biased in that I have spent my whole life trying to immerse myself in the Bible and understand it. And the more time I spend in it, the more I love it and see how much more there is to see and how much there is to learn. And what I find is that the deeper that I dig, there's still more. I'm slowly working my way through the laws of Exodus right now for a commentary that I'm writing on Exodus. And I just find these laws, they're so old, but they're so rich and so wise. And I keep being surprised at how relevant they feel even for modern times. And it's like they have this quality that is unmatched in anything else I've read. Granted, I probably haven't read as widely even as you have. I didn't go through a great books program where I was reading all the ancient literature. But from what I've seen, the Bible there's something really unique about it. It's had incredibly enduring impact on culture.
Yeah. Can I make a clarification real quick? I think so. Nietzsche, his very positive outlook seems to be about the Old Testament exclusively.
Okay. And the New Testament he thinks is not.
And yeah, so he
Okay.
kind of talks about how the Old Testament is such a grand epic.
Mm-hmm.
that, the Greeks like Homer,
Mm-hmm.
even their literature isn't that good.
Yeah. Okay.
But he says to have bound this up with the New Testament is a great audacity which literary Europe has upon its conscience. So it seems that
Okay.
his reverence might be a poor word to choose. He has great respect for the Old Testament, but that it's ruined somehow by being bound up in the same book as the New Testament. Can you
It's so
talk
funny
a little bit
because it's
about
like
that?
the opposite of how most people feel about it. Like, oh,
Right.
here's Jesus and the New Testament. We like that, but we really don't know what to do with the Old Testament.
Right. It's a very inverted
Yes.
look
That
at
makes
modern
Thank you for
opinion.
clarifying. That makes a little more sense of
Sure. Yeah.
why we're hearing this coming from Nietzsche.
Yes. Yeah.
Who probably didn't have a lot of use for Jesus. Um, yeah, I think there's definitely a different vibe in the New Testament as compared to the Old Testament. And, many people aren't aware, but you can just simply check your Bible and see that 3/4 of the Bible is the Old Testament. So its epic quality is partly due to its length and the number of centuries that it's covering in terms of history. The New Testament is like a popcorn of perspectives and dialogues that are happening all in a very contentious time. Um, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus is happening in a time of great turmoil in the Roman world, and so things aren't settled, and we don't have the benefit of kind of a long view looking back. We're getting it sort of as it comes. And maybe that's part of what he's feeling. Like it's
Mm.
popcorn, it's all over the place. We've got Paul writing to people and he's trying to put out fires and he's trying to figure out how to sort things out so that things can grow in the right direction. And it's only maybe now, 2,000 years later, that we would maybe write this story differently. But what we have is God's inspired perspective on this time of tumult. And I
Mm.
guess that's one of the things that I find really beautiful about the Bible is that God is not giving us some kind of sterile, packaged view, but that He's allowing people who are right in the midst of the mess to reflect on it and see where they see God at work. And our lives are, in fact, a mess much of the time. And so there's a relatability, I think, that I wouldn't want to trade away.
Mm. Yeah. Wow. Thank you very much. We're about out of time. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk today. If people were wanting to see more of your work, where could they go online or maybe books that you've published?
So I have two books that are out there that are good for general audiences. You don't have to be a scholar to appreciate them. One is called Bearing God's Name: Why Sinai Still Matters. You probably caught that I'm a big fan of Exodus. And so that book talks about how God adopts his people as his own at Sinai and traces that theme of bearing God's name through the rest of the Bible. The other one is Being God's Image: Why Creation Still Matters. And that takes a broader view of what does it mean to be human and what are humans here for? What's our purpose in life? I'm pretty active online. I'm on Facebook and Twitter, or X. I have a YouTube channel where I release weekly videos called Torah Tuesday. And so people can find me in any of those places. And I have a blog, carmenjoyimes.blogspot.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing. And thank you for coming on today, Dr. Imes.
Thanks so much for having me.